So I think it's often worth really re-examining, going back over a lot of the stuff that leave and the promises that they made, because one of the big areas that apparently they really cared about was fishing. But the more you actually look into the issues that surround fishing, the more you realise that actually Leave knew nothing about fishing. It really didn't care to address any really the underlying causes, except apparently leaving the EU is just good for them. Somehow it's just good. It's just good. Not how it's going to be good, what the effects are going to be. Never mind the fact that a lot of our fish actually is sold into Europe. So there's going to be a massive damage to the fishers, who now have to put on tariffs, who are now have their fish stopped at the border. And remember, in case of fish is a really time-sensitive product. The longer it's out of the sea, the less money it's worth. So the quicker that a British fishing boat can sell its fish into Europe, the better price it can get for it. And the second you leave the single market, customs union, you put up barriers. And that will cost the British fishing industry millions of pounds. And there's a lot of people that are going to say, oh, well, fish is going to become cheaper. It doesn't matter, because one of the things we discussed ages ago about this was the fact that tastes, especially that people have changed. The reason why the fishing industry used to be really big was that Britain was at one time heavily religious. So on Sundays, some Fridays, unanimously, pretty much every Sunday, and some Fridays throughout the year, people would only eat fish. In fact, if you were Christian in this country during Lent, if you gave up meat, then you might only eat fish for that month. Benefiting massively the British fishing industry. But those have changed. The culture and tastes of people have changed because of how available meat is and how cheap meat is now. When you've got to look at it back over the years, meat's become a lot cheaper. So that's made, fish just has a lot more competition, so we say now. And we're going to look over a very good blog by Richard Colbert, who's the MEP for Yorkshire and Humber. And he goes into this deeply. So, Brexit and the common fisheries policy. What happens to the fisheries sector if we leave the EU's common fisheries policy? It's exactly what he goes over, and he does this in really good detail. So we're going to go over his blog, because he brings up a lot of stuff. And bear in mind, you are going to see all this stuff that gets brought up, Brexiteers never talk about, because, as we said at the beginning of this video, they talk about how much they care about this industry, but they know nothing about it. They care to just nothing, essentially. It's just, for them, it's just a really interesting soundboard, and that people can be it's a good talking point more than anything. They don't have to be knowledgeable about it. They just have to say, fishing will be good when we leave the EU. And that's all they have to say. But these are the facts, essentially. So, the introduction. So, one thing's for sure. The claims made by the Leave campaign that Brexit means we will be able to run a completely different national policy, reserve all rights to fish in the UK's exclusive economic zone to UK fishers, and still export duty-free to the rest of Europe, are completely pie in the sky. As a recent House of Lords report on the issue said, the vote to leave has raised expectations for the future of fisheries policy that may be hard to deliver. So let's actually have a look at the right to fish. So, fish have the unfortunate habit of swimming from one country's waters to another, and joint management is the only way to prevent overfishing from depleting stocks. Many species spend various stages of their life cycles in different countries' waters, and their spawning grounds are often in different areas from where they are caught and where they mature. The practical reality, therefore, means that joint decisions have to be reached on sharing out fishing rights and are then enforcing respect for what has been agreed. So this idea of one thing that says, oh, we'll get rid of fishing quotas, that would be dumb, because as I said here, you would lead to a massive problem of overfishing. And then where would the British fishing industry be when, they can't catch any fish in British waters? But that's beside the point, because, as we'll soon find out, this is in any case required under international law. Britain and the EU and its member countries are all party to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which lays down that countries must jointly manage fish stocks that migrate between two or more countries' waters. This applies to more than 100 stocks present in UK waters. Such stocks have to be managed at levels which do not exceed the maximum sustainability yield, and the same commitment the UK has under EU law as specified in the recently reformed Common Fisheries Policy. Even avowed Eurosceptics Fisheries Minister George Eustice repeatedly backpedalled on his claims made by Brexit supporters, admitting, quote, when it is said we are going to take back control, it sounds perhaps more dramatic than it might be, in that we would still engage in international negotiations around mutual access rights, mutual shares and the like, and that the UK will be bound by clear commitments to the shared goals. And that's a Brexit fisheries minister backpedalling massively. The aforementioned Lords report said that across the industry there is, quote, widespread agreement that the UK should continue to fund and take advice from the International Council on the Exploration of the Sea. Exactly the same scientific advice which is the basis of the total allowable catches that are agreed on at the EU level. So essentially, even though you'd leave, nothing changes. Because once again, Brexiteers are blaming the EU for a problem that is put forward internationally, solved at a UN level. And the EU came together to negotiate these to help countries find out on these points. So, so hopefully I'm enlightening a lot of people on this. So, nor is it reserving UK waters to British fishers a simple matter. The rights of fishers from several other European countries to access and fish in UK waters and vice versa, some 20% of fish caught by British boats are actually from other countries, are in large part diverged from international law and historic fishing rights, predating our entry into the EU in 1973. They would only marginally be changed by Brexit. Indeed, some legal experts hold that most of the historic rights were codified within the 1964 London Fisheries Convention, which means there are some 32 areas of the British coast where other states can fish. A complete closure of the UK zone to foreign vessels would probably only be possible if the UK chose to terminate such agreements, a course of action that would jeopardise all agreements on fishing and therefore result in fish stocks being overfished. It would also inevitably invite retaliatory action as regard to reciprocal rights for British fishers, and it could also see other countries in the EU, our biggest market for fish exports, slapping a tariff or quota on British fish exports. So, ability to negotiate. So, our ability to negotiate will remain crucial. But with Brexit, we will no longer be negotiating with other EU countries as an equal partner around the table, but only one against many. Other countries will thrash out joint positions before negotiating with Britain, and they would be inclined to conclude a more favourable deal to the UK than we have now than we have now, our own minister admits, in that the North Sea is a generally accepted that we have an allocation which would be considered fair. Inside the EU, countries collectively agree total allowable catches every year. The European Commission proposes a TAC for commercial spaces of each area within the EU, based on the scientific advice from the ICES. Once agreed by the national ministers in the EU Council, the TACs are then divided among member states in the form of national quotas on the basis of relative sustainability. The allocation key, which is based on historic catch levels and grants EU countries a fixed percentage for each of the fish stocks in question. For example, in 2015, the UK was allocated quotas amounting to 28,000 tonnes of North Sea haddock, equal to 84% of the EU total catch allowance, and 34,000 tonnes of the North Sea Pallas, I think that's how you say that fish. That is equal to 28% of the total allowable catch. So each member state then allocates the quotas that it receives to fishers in that country. The current method of allocating quotas within the UK has been criticised for disadvantaging smaller vessels, and indeed given a huge share of the quota to a single Dutch-owned vessel. A criticism frequently directed to Brussels, despite this being an entirely UK decision. So outside the EU, countries like Norway and Iceland negotiate with it, facing a joint proposition agreed on by EU member states. From the day of Brexit, Britain will be in a similar position and will need to have in place agreements with the EU so that shared stocks can be managed, access arrangement for fishing vessels can be negotiated, and trade in fish products can continue. Britain will also no longer be part to the agreements of the EU that is negotiated with third countries, at least the important northern agreements, such as with Norway, Iceland and the Faroe Islands. Britain will cease to be included in the quotas and mutual access agreements the European Commission negotiates on behalf of member states and the third countries. What happens to the UK's share of such agreements will be an issue. In any case, new bilateral or trilateral agreements will be necessary, and it will be needed quickly, unless a long transitional period of maintaining the current status quo is agreed. So such negotiations have historically proved to be more difficult than the internal EU ones. Disagreement arose, for example, over the total catch allowance and the quota that each country would receive for mackerel in the northeast Atlantic. Each party then acted unilaterally for several years, with the results that stocks were grossly overfished, and even George Eustace conceded that one of the shortcomings of these looser types of agreements is that, unlike the EU, where ultimately comes down to a vote on the QMV, that's the quantity majority voting, if all else fails, it's harder to sometimes reach an agreement at all. UK membership of the relevant regional fisheries bodies, particularly the North East Atlantic Fisheries Commission, will also have to be secured. And now you get onto the rules about fishing as well. The government has said that its Great Repeal Bill, it will aim to bring all existing EU rules into national law, which it can then review, maintain, amend, repeal or repeal over time. This includes the CPF rules. It has taken years to reverse the decline in fish stocks, which began well before the CPF, but many years it failed to adequately address. Following the 2013 reforms, many at British instigation, the CPF is at least on better track, and there were fewer things that Britain could do differently if it could. Some fishers hoped that Britain might relax the EU ban on throwing away fish at sea. However, this discarded ban was supported, indeed pushed for, by the British government when it was agreed. It was even a Conservative Party manifesto commitment, so it is unlikely that the government will seek to repeal it. Quota hopping, the practice of fisheries from other EU countries benefiting from UK quotas by setting up UK companies to buy UK fishing vessels and therefore quotas, is possible because of freedom of establishment, not because of the common fisheries policy. Whether this is maintained post-Brexit is unlikely to be determined in the course of wider negotiations on withdrawal, where the interests of other economic sectors will not necessarily be the same. So this whole idea of, apparently where, this is perfectly allowed. And by the way, UK companies are perfectly allowed to go and do the same. So as we saw above, Britain is almost certainly going to continue to negotiate total catch allowances and quotas with the EU. And its own management system will be based on the same scientific data from the ICS and the same objectives, notably at researching and then keeping stocks above the level that produces maximum stability yield, an objective that cannot be reached alone. So as fishing will often be seen as cross-border, there will also be need to coordinate rules on technical measures, allowing fishing gear, mesh sizes, etc. Through the CPF, a number of standards have been adopted to tackle illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing. Compliance with these standards could be a requirement for continued trade with the EU. There will also have to be several long-term stock recovery programs that have been agreed at an EU level that affect shared stocks found in the UK and other waters, which the EU will pass for Britain to remain signed up to. These include the multi-annual plan of the Sole and Pallis in the North Sea, the recovery plan for the Northern Hike, Kattegat, Chirac and North Sea, the Channel west of Scotland and all around Ireland and the Bay of Biscay, the multi-annual plan for Sole Western Channel, the long-term plan for West Scotland herring, measurements for the recovery of eel, and the new long-term plan for cod stocks. Until it eventually actually leaves, the UK will continue to have a say at the current EU legislative proposals, and it could have an effect on Britain after its withdrawal. One of its particular significance to the UK include a proposal on the conservation of fishery resources and the protection of marine ecosystems through technical measures, notably fishing gear, and it's a multi-annual plan for decimal stocks of the North Sea, and a multi-annual plan for the management of dismal fisheries, I think that's how you say it, dismersal, I think that's how you say it, fisheries in the northwestern EU waters. So what does this have effect on trade? So trade, Britain exports around 80% of its catch to other EU countries. And yet, fisheries want to leave? Again, based on all the evidence that we've seen so far, the EU is doing nothing but to help fisheries to make sure that their livelihoods continue and that there are sufficient stocks left. And once again, the competition thing, that's not an EU thing, that's a UK law that allows like we said, the Dutch to come over, set up a British fishing company with a British boat and then contribute to go out and catch UK quotas. So this exports around 80% of catch to other EU countries and imports the vast majority of the fish that are processed or consumed in Britain, which either come from the EU or countries or with whom the EU has agreed preferential trade relations. It is vital for our industry, not least the processing sector in Grimsby, but for our consumers, that this can continue without impediment. However, if we leave the EU without preferential trade agreement, WTO's rules would apply, and this would face tariffs on fish products from 2% on Atlantic salmon to 20% on frozen mackerel and up to 25% on highly processed products. Equally, the EU would face tariffs on exporting to the UK at a level agreed between the UK and the WTO. If our aim is to secure a free trade agreement, it is important to remember that trade in fish and seafood products is not normally part of a standard free trade deal. Indeed, Norway and Iceland, despite being members of the European Economic Area, and thus for the most and thus for most purposes the single market too, are nevertheless subject to tariffs and quotas on many fisheries products. Of course, even if we do agree a trade deal with zero tariffs, if we leave the customs union, there will be rules on origin checks at the borders, which could trigger a lot of paperwork and can cause hold-ups and are particularly damaging for products where freshness is essential. The UK will also cease to be party to the agreements reached between the between the EU and third countries, so replacement agreements for the UK alone would have to be negotiated, and negotiated quickly, as the Lord's report concluded, quote, "The UK may be able to renegotiate new preferential trade relations with non-EU countries, though such negotiations are likely to be complicated and time-consuming. It is uncertain whether new markets would be able to replace or compensate for current exports to the EU, and even the government's own reports say they can't. Even this wonderful trade deal that they want to do with the US will not replace our lost trade with the EU. So, nor are trade deals just about tariffs and quotas. They are also about standards and quality. The EU regulates market standards for fish products, giving consumer assurances about the quality and integrity of the fish, and it will be necessary to meet those standards in order to sell into EU markets. The compliance with import standards is also essential for UK vessels that land their catches directly into EU ports. Though the constitution of this practice will continue anyway, it will also be subject to negotiation with the EU. At present, we meet those standards because they are set jointly by us and other EU members. But once we leave, we shall either have to follow those rules or no longer have any say on them, or forgo selling into the EU, our main export market." So this whole thing that you get a lot of the time from Brexiteers about, oh, we can get rid of all these red tapes and things like that. Well, any company that sells into the EU will now have to follow those standards and will have to fill out paperwork so that they can import. And remember, paperwork, I don't know if you've actually seen how big that paperwork actually looks, but they are huge, massive files about that big just to import like one box of stuff. This is huge, and we are saying that we are now having to bring those back. So, the financial support for fishing communities and infrastructure. So the EU's Maritime and Fisheries Fund provides support for fishing communities and fishers, including for fishing ports, safety on vessels, landing sites, auction halls, shelters and equipment. Fishing has also benefited from EU research funding and fishing communities from the IBE loans. Whether the government will replace all this following Brexit is far from certain, bearing in mind the significant hit to public finances in general and the wider economic effects on Brexit will cause. So we get all this funding from the EU and it's gone completely. And as we discussed in the past, I don't know if you remember, we went over the fact that many councils rely on EU funds to be able to stay afloat. So post-Brexit, expect many councils to go bankrupt. And it's worth pointing out that the first council to go bankrupt was a Conservative one. Just pointing that out. So, this next part, internal UK stresses. So, fisheries management is a devolution matter for which the CPF has a common framework across the UK 4 nation parts. Post-Brexit, this framework will fall away, raising the potential of 4 different UK fisheries management regimes. And it will not necessarily be easy for the UK government and the devolved administration to agree on domestic fisheries policies after Brexit. So during negotiations, and in those with the third countries, given the practicalities and size of the Scottish fisheries, the Scottish Government will want to be fully and directly involved in defining the UK position and even having a lead negotiation role for issues in which Scotland has a majority interest. Staff. This is another thing that we are going to face. A significant proportion, as high as 50% in some places, of of people working in the fisheries processing sector come from other EU member states. Any further restrictions on freedom of movement could cause difficulties, and we've discussed this before. This is not the only sector that is going to have problem hiring people. So finally, the conclusions. Those who expect great changes to come as a result of leaving the common fisheries policy, and those who hoped that new opportunities would arise, are likely to be disappointed. The promises made by the Leave campaign were far-fetched. There is even a serious risk that in a number of crucial aspects, the British fishing industry will be worse off outside the European Union. And then this was an update which I found quite interesting, because this goes to talk about Scotland in particular. So one thing people forget is the customs union. If the UK pulls out every shipment of fish, shellfish will require a health certificate from DEFRA in Carlisle, issued in advance of about 5 to 14 days, with the exact weight per box, no use for shellfish, a certain a certificate of origin, normally the Chamber of Commerce, a bit of a problem in the Highlands and Islands, as well as having a veterinary officer on site for every dispatch to signal to sign for certificates, whether that be 1 kilogram or a 26-ton container. To seal the shipment with secure tags. This is an impossible expense for the lobster and language fishermen, with about 20 kilograms for Madrid, as well as a 20% tariff and the £350 to £600 price for a vet waiting for a lorry to turn up. It's a price-sensitive market, adding in effect about 30% plus the paperwork for buyers at customs points in Spain and France. It will decimate the rural Highland and Island economy, and we are currently 85% of where the shellfish goes to the EU markets. So that's another area of the country that's essentially going to be decimated under a no-deal Brexit. So I hope you've learned a lot more about fishing there. Like I say, Richard Kober has written a lot of very, very good blogs about what's going to happen under a no-deal Brexit, because it's more, the Brexiteers have this idea that somehow we'll just break away and everything will be fine. It'll be fine, but no. There are huge, huge implications. Just that fishing alone has raised loads of different points about things and international law that we are a part of, that the Common Fisheries Policies was set up to try and tackle, for the European countries that fish can work together. We are still going to have to do this post-Europe, and the quotas for fishing, they're still going to be there. And a lot of fishers were hoping that they could just be gone and be done with and got rid of. But no, they're not. Fishing and all this area is really complex. The more you read into it, the more you start to realise that all these slogans that Leave said about fishing were just complete nonsense and just pie in the sky thinking.